Hello, welcome. Today we're going to talk about our usual book. Today we're diving into the stories of the 4 romances of the King Arthur cycle. I hope you're keeping up with the reading and enjoying our reflection on stories that, deep down, are all our own stories. This book, the theme, you've already noticed. It's us fighting against the shadows. This is shown from various angles. Let's move on to a story from the Arthurian cycle. Today we're going to talk about Gawain and the Green Knight. So let's first tell the story as we've been doing and simultaneously highlight the symbolic elements present there. Notice that, of course, I've been using everything that's in the book, but I've also added some of my own insights. This is more than necessary, isn't it? As my grandmother used to say, who tells a tale adds a tale. That's pretty much what we do, not with the intention of distorting, but with the intention of adding more elements that allow us to understand. So, it's not just the author's commentary. I've added some of my own comments, and I hope you can also add your own insights. This way, we start building a structure of independent thought. Extract something from it that can be experienced by us. So let's get started. Have you seen it? The story. It takes place at King Arthur's court during a specific time between the longest night of the year, which is Christmas, the winter solstice, this opportune moment for the birth of something spiritual, and between the Epiphany, in this case, the day of the wise men. For those who don't remember, Epiphany means revelation. And there are 3 epiphanies within the biblical story, which would be the day of the wise men, where the child receives homage, the recognition from the kings, the wise men, revealing himself to them as a son of God. Then, at the baptism, where he is also presented, he reveals himself, and at the wedding at Canaan. So, the first epiphany is the day of the wise men. At some point between Christmas and the day of the wise men, that is, between December 25th and January 6th, into King Arthur's court walks a man entirely green, a man of enormous height, with immense strength and green skin, green clothes, everything green. He enters the throne room and is going to challenge the knights of the Round Table, saying the following, "I don't believe it. I don't find it acceptable that there are only cowards here who won't accept my challenge. I will give you an ancient axe, an old hatchet that I carry with me, and now you must try to cut off my head. With a single blow. Whether you succeed or not, in the next year, in the new cycle, you will meet me at the Green Chapel, where it will be my turn to do the same to whoever steps forward, whoever accepts this challenge." Evidently, this seemed a bit strange to the people there. First, it's terrifying, because a man of that size, if you miss the blow, you're done for. Secondly, they thought, once someone kills him, there won't be a next year. But they didn't know that he wasn't exactly a human being. And therefore, whether his head was cut off or not, he would be alive for the next year. And then, none of the knights step forward. All are gripped by the terror of thinking that challenge impossible. And King Arthur himself stands up, because he had to save the honor of the Round Table. He was going to go himself. But then his nephew, Gawain, stands up and says, "No. No, my lord, I will go. I accept the challenge." Gawain, who is a very common knight in the heroic tales of the Arthurian cycle, for those who don't know, a little curiosity, he passes down this surname throughout history. It becomes Gawain and is the origin of the surname Galvão from Portugal, which later came to Brazil. Galvão from Brazil and Portugal, a hello to all of you, because I am one of them too. So it would be White Hawk, originating from hawk. And it was said that, probably, the origin of this surname indeed comes from this knight. And Gawain then stands up and accepts the challenge. He goes ahead, the giant bends over, exposing his neck. Gawain takes that ancient axe and, without a second thought, delivers a single blow and cuts off the giant's head, which goes rolling away. But the giant doesn't die from that. He stands up, picks up his head under his arm, the head still talking, and he says, "Now it's your turn. In the new year, in this next cycle, meaning a year from now, we will meet at the Green Chapel, and you will do the same to me. Expose your neck so that I can cut it with my axe." And he leaves. Gawain finds that strange. But well, it's done. This is part of the historical necessity. He is a knight, a great knight. He doesn't think twice. So I have 1 year to live until next year. I will have to lose my life, because no one escapes a giant like that with an axe in hand. Let's take a moment to pause and reflect on this. We see that when you go through the winter solstice. I've talked a lot about this in various lectures. We have a duality in the year, which is spring and summer, equinox and solstice, and on the other side, autumn and winter, equinox and solstice, once again. One of them represents the peak of physical life, which culminates with summer, and the other, the peak of metaphysical life, which culminates with winter. So, at this moment, we have the closing of the winter cycle. Soon after, spring will come, and then, once again, summer. So, it's a cycle that usually closes, an era. Imagine physical life and metaphysical life. Normally in nature, they alternate. When you have a very harsh winter, physical life practically retreats. There are certain animals that hibernate, while metaphysical life feels more encouraged. And that's the moment when the monks would write their works. That's the moment for introspection and inner life. Then, when metaphysical life begins to decline, it's time to return to earth. Returning to physical life is almost like a rebirth. Where does metaphysical life retreat to its minimum? And now you go out to share what you've gathered in your inner life. Now is the time for physical life, for the blossoming of life, for the rebirth that will occur Iona in the spring. You'll see that, indeed. Recently, I was talking about this with you. That this winter cycle, where it is believed that the spirits, the souls of the dead, are closer to the world. Physically, this is concluded and sealed with one of the symbols of the carnival festival. The intention was to ward off these spirits, to open a new cycle that, after Lent, would blossom with the spring. Above all, folks, we will see that if you look at the tradition. Irish Celtic, the original Gaelic tradition, we will see that they indeed had 4 major celebrations throughout the year. And they were neither the solstices nor the equinoxes, but points in between them. So you have winter, summer, spring, fall, and among these 4, there were the so-called 4 festivals, especially what they called Beltane and what they called Samhain. Samhain is situated between autumn and winter. Beltane was between spring and summer. Consider that the Earth's orbit around the Sun is elliptical. As Kepler used to say, Sun is at one of the foci. It's true that it's an ellipse very much like Plato's Academy. Almost circular, but it's an ellipse. So, when you consider that the cold era is about to begin, it actually starts halfway between autumn and winter. The winter solstice is the peak of the cold. It's not the beginning of the cold, nor is it the end of the cold. So, the beginning of the cold for them was about a month and a half earlier. That is, at the very end of October, the very beginning of November, this was the period when it was celebrated. The Samhain, where the winter forces, the forces of the metaphysical world, drew closer to the earth. The same thing with summer. Summer doesn't start at the solstice. At the solstice, you're already halfway through summer. It begins between spring and summer, in the middle, which is Beltane, where the physical forces, the forces of nature, are at their peak and begin to grow. Until they reach their peak, then decline. After the solstice, the season is already declining. That's interesting, so these forces, these elements that are within this Christmas cycle, up until Epiphany, until the Day of the Wise Men, which then conclude later on. These are metaphysical forces, and it's necessary for you to make the transition between this and a new life cycle. It's as if physical life is being reborn. Look, the transition between heaven and earth is classically represented by the color green. In fact, I once visited one of those medieval Gothic cathedrals, which, at the beginning of the spring equinox, cast a green light over the altar. For a very simple reason. The sky is represented as blue and the earth as yellow. The midpoint between the blue of the sky and the yellow of the earth is green. It's when life descends from the heavens and returns to the earth. So, this green night that enters right after the solstice, posing a challenge for those knights who were there. Evidently, they were setting a test of rebirth. Who was worthy of rebirth, who was worthy of purification for the next cycle? What he proposes there is not a challenge of death, or at least not the kind of death we conceive of today, which is elimination. More death in the sense of dying to one plane of consciousness and being reborn in another. The death he offered was not a total death, but a subtle death to one realm, to be reborn with more awareness in another. But, evidently, this is not understood, nor is it clearly stated within the tale. You have to see through it. An important thing we haven't mentioned yet. The ancient weapon, the ancient axe. The axe is a hatchet, which you will usually see. There's the Danish one, the Marquis, there is the Frankish one, and there is the Greco-Roman one. Usually, the medieval one we know, which is more the Danish model, has a half moon on one side and, on the other side, a point. Or when it comes to a halberd, on the other side, it has something pointed, anyway. But if you take a myth of King Arthur, which is a medieval cycle, and they talk about an ancient axe, it can't be something medieval. It has to be something prior to them. So, it's likely that they are referring here to the Greco-Roman axe, which had a double edge. Imagine two convex blades. This double-edged axe, or double-edged hatchet, is one of the most symbolic things there is, because in Greek mythology, it is with it that Theseus kills the Minotaur. He simultaneously represents both external and internal work. He who builds outwardly and simultaneously builds inwardly. So, it's yet another clue that what this giant is proposing is a break from an internal phase. A rebirth on another plane. In other words, to enter a new phase. A new spring, a new year, you enter a new phase, also within. What he is proposing, symbolically expressed by all the circumstances, is an elevation of the level of consciousness, to be worthy of rebirth. So, when the time comes to walk towards his meeting, Gawain sets out to find the Green Chapel. It's interesting because he sets out exactly on the date of Samhain. In other words, All Saints' Day is November 1st. November 2nd is All Souls' Day, and on the eve of all this, October 31st, was the celebration of Samhain, from where our tradition of Halloween also came. Day of the Dead, Feast of the Dead, Mexican, and everything else that is related to this tradition. Because, for the Gaelic tradition, Samhain is the moment when the dead and the living come closest together. It's as if life and death were separated by a thin veil. And these worlds can intermingle. You'll see that the lantern inside the pumpkin head was lit so that our deceased ancestors could find their way home, so they could reunite with their living relatives. This is also true in Mexico. It's the same tradition, meaning there is a communication between these two worlds during the Samhain festival, which marks the Gaelic New Year. It's on this date that Gawain decides to start his journey. This meeting point of the two worlds. And where is he going? He hadn't seen where the Green Knight went. He didn't know where the Green Chapel was. For some reason, no one followed the Green Knight to see which way he went. Nor did he ask him. For some reason, Gawain decides to march towards the north. We will see, then, that in various traditions of our language, we still talk about this today, that there is something about seeking the north. As if we were searching for something more spiritual, because it's a place where the cold prevails over. From the south, where the heat prevails, when we see that a person is lost, we often say they are disoriented. The north is often identified within traditions because it's the place where the North Star is visible. In our historical moment and in Arthur's story, we also went through the same cycle where the Earth's axis completes its full cycle. Because the Earth's axis spins like a top in a cycle of 25,800 years. In our current historical moment, it is pointing towards the constellation of Ursa Minor, specifically towards Polaris, which is the alpha star of Ursa Minor. So, it's as if this star marks the Earth's axis. This is interesting because all those seeking wisdom seek their axis. They seek their essence, their most intimate nature, and, therefore, symbolically. This is expressed in seeking the Earth's axis, seeking the star Polaris. Ursa Minor, see how interesting that is, because the very name Arthur comes from Arthur Bear. The goddess Arthur was the protective goddess of the bears among the heavens. So, the very name Arthur is associated with the bear. It is said that in ancient mythology, in other eras, great beings, heroes, whose names were associated with the dragon because the previous North Star belonged to the dragon. It was the alpha star of the constellation Draco. So, there is something here that might seem a bit confusing to you. But when we seek the North Star, it means we are searching for the Earth's axis, that is, its center, our spiritual essence. A cold and distant place where we have the bridge to our spiritual essence, where a star points to our essence. And this is very present within Arthurian mythology. Arthur himself is a son of the bear. He is a bear himself, a servant of Arctos. Well, and he walks, then, towards the north. A very rough journey, because the further he goes towards the north, the colder it gets. And when he comes across a village, he asks everyone, "Does anyone know about the Green Chapel? Does anyone know?" No one had ever heard of it. Until, on Christmas Eve, he decides to kneel and pray the Virgin and ask Christ himself to help him find a place where he could pay his Christmas respects, where he could honor the birth of Christ. And after this prayer, in a somewhat miraculous way, after a few steps, he finds a grand castle, a great house. And at this castle, when he knocks on the door, he is greeted by a gigantic man. A somewhat rough appearance, a bit intimidating, by his wife, a very beautiful wife, and by a very dignified elderly woman. It's as if he had truly found a trinity of goodness, represented by the elder, of beauty, represented by the hostess, the wife, and of justice, represented by her husband, who, despite having a somewhat hostile appearance, welcomes him warmly. The fame of the Knights of the Round Table spread throughout all those lands. Therefore, having a Knight of the Round Table in their home was an honor. They receive him with all courtesy, serving him very well. And this knight intended to leave. The master of the house intended to go out for his hunts the next day. And he makes a very strange agreement with Gawain that every time he went out and hunted something outside, he would give it to Gawain. But Gawain would have to give him, in return, everything he hunted within the castle itself. What can one hunt inside a castle? What can one gain without leaving home? It seemed strange, but later, Gawain would begin to understand how this worked. On the morning when the knight sets out with his animals and his pages for the hunt, that night, the knight's wife, the wife of the master of the castle, goes to Gawain's room and begins to offer herself to him, trying to seduce him. And she was a stunning woman. He feels her beauty, feels the temptation, but he resists. I can never stop being a Knight of the Round Table. A man who is treating me so well, I cannot betray him. It's not worth exchanging a moment of pleasure for dishonor. That's not right, even if I am going to die. At least they are an honorable people, because for him his death was certain. So she tries in every way, but he does not reciprocate, and she gives him a kiss. Well, the next morning, the Castellan, the master of the castle, arrives and brings a great hunt, laying everything out in a line, an enormous amount of animals that had been hunted, lays everything out on the ground and tells Gawain that it all belongs to him. And Gawain goes to the Castellan and gives him a kiss, which was all he had hunted in the house that day. He had received a kiss from his wife, so he gives a kiss to the Castellan. Well, this is my part of the bargain. The two laugh a lot together and find the whole situation very amusing, and so it continues. The next day, the master of the castle sets out with his pages and his dogs to go hunting. And the wife goes to Gawain's bed at night and tries in every possible way to seduce him, doing everything she can. And he doesn't give in even a millimeter, not even looking at her. And she, admitting defeat for that day, gives him 2 kisses. The next morning, look how curious. The Castellan arrives, not with a bunch of animals, but with a single animal he had hunted, a large bear. Exactly the idea of the bear. He begins to draw closer through his conduct. Straight, he begins to approach the center, the axis, marked by the star of the little bear. So, he brings him a bear. And Gawain returns, as agreed, the 2 kisses he had received. And the two laugh a lot once again, and another day goes by. The next morning, the Castellan goes out for his hunt, and it was already New Year's Eve, and therefore it would be Gawain's last day staying in that house. The last night, the next day, he would have to leave. Once again, the wife goes to his quarters and tries to tempt him. In every way, she gets nothing from him. Since she couldn't seduce him, he tries in every way not to let her feel offended, not to feel humiliated, but he refuses any and all advances. She tries to establish some kind of connection between them. Since he didn't want her, maybe he didn't want something from her that could connect the two of them in some way, even if symbolically. She takes a ring off her finger and tries to offer it to him. But he knew that a ring establishes a commitment. A ring connects the heart, a ring establishes a pact. A ring. In various traditions, a king would give a ring to a knight he trusted, meaning it's a sign of trust and connection. And he evidently did not want to establish any connection, so he doesn't accept the ring. And that woman is left a bit unsure, wondering what he would accept from me. And suddenly, she looks at his waist and sees a little piece, a belt, a small piece of green string. It was nothing more than that, a piece of green string, almost nothing. She takes it from her waist and offers it to him. He once again refuses and doesn't even look. She tries to place it in his hand, tries to close his hand around it, but he doesn't accept. She says, "Look, this is a magic cord. It has the power to protect, to safeguard the life of the one who wears it." And this news shakes Gawain, because deep down he had the intention to live. Deep down he was tormented by the thought of his untimely death in the prime of his youth, which was to happen the very next day. Deep down he had the desire to find something that could save him. And this small weakness, this little fear he had, makes him take the cord and keep it with him. And then the lady gives him 3 kisses. The next morning, see how curious, the Lord arrives. And the only thing he had hunted was a fox. He arrives embarrassed by such a poor hunt. And he gives that to Gawain, as had been agreed. And Gawain, instead of giving him the cord, which he had received, as was agreed upon, he only gives him the 3 kisses. See, a fox, which symbolically is associated with betrayal. It's the moment when Gawain left a crack in his courage, in his honor as a knight of the Round Table. He doesn't hand over the cord. And so, the next day, he sets off. He is led by a page to near the path of the Green Chapel, and there the page says to him, "Look, no one has ever returned." Then, give up, run away, you won't stand a chance. And yet he continues on his way, a little encouraged by the courage that the green cord gave him tied around his arm, under his clothes, but also fearful of what he would encounter ahead. Arriving at the Green Chapel, the chapel was actually a gateway to a kind of very ancient underground cave. Dark, seemingly abandoned, this is another very interesting thing, folks. Because, for those who have some knowledge of myths, they know that the cave is a symbol of rebirth. The cave Samhain was a symbol of initiation, of rebirth. It was a baptism for various traditions. Samhain of the underground, of Abydos, for example, for Egypt. It was the symbol of one who was born twice, of one who was reborn into the realm of the spirit. The chapel was exactly a cave, partly underground, partly obscure. When he dismounts from his horse and enters, he hears someone sharpening an axe in the distance. He shouts, "I am Gawain, I am here." And the man asks him to wait a moment. Soon he appears. It was the Green Knight with his very well sharpened axe, his hatchet. And Gawain takes his position. He lowers his neck as he had seen the other do. But when the axe gets close, fear speaks louder in him, and he slightly raises his shoulder. The knight immediately stops the axe and says, "What is this? Are you afraid? What a disgrace! How can you do such a thing?" Gawain gets a bit annoyed and says, "Look, I can't be sure that my severed head will still be mine. But let's do it again." And then, once again, Gawain takes his position, and now he remains completely still, waiting for the axe that would cut off his head. And the giant comes and gets close to his head with the axe. And he says, "Very well, now I like what I see. You really did yourself justice." And Gawain is a bit irritated with that. "Well, so, what time are you going to do it? Rest assured that your expectations will not be disappointed." And for the third time, he comes with the axe, but instead of striking Gawain's neck, he just grazes it. It makes a small scratch on the skin, from which a trickle of blood flows. And Ensi stands up a bit perplexed and says, "What do you mean?" "Now let's get to the fight, because you said it was a single attempt, and you missed." And the knight said, "No, actually, I gave you what you deserved. The first 2 attempts corresponded to the first 2 days, where you gave me what my wife had given you. I asked her to do that. You returned the kisses she had given you. On the 3rd day, you were loyal in returning the kisses, but you weren't completely loyal, because that green cord you have is mine and you didn't return it. She made it for me and you didn't return it." He did it because, deep down, he regretted dying. Deep down, he had quite a bit of fear of death. And Gala stands up and acknowledges this. And he feels tremendously humiliated and irritated. Cursed be fear and desire. And the knight said that he had already received the punishment he deserved, but that he was still a great knight. He was a pearl among mere stones, amidst insignificant things, he was a pearl of value. Look, a pearl, but not a diamond. I'll explain that in a moment. And Gawain tries to return the green cord to him, and he says, "No, that stays with you." Then Gawain ties it to his arm and says, "I will keep this next to my skin to forever remind me of the mistake I made today." He returned. The knight invites him to return to his castle, but he declines and goes back once more to King Arthur's court. Upon arriving there, he tells his entire story. The men, contrary to what he thought, become more proud of his victory than ashamed of his mistake, and it becomes a tradition. And from then on, the Knights of the Round Table start wearing, under their clothes, a green cord. It's interesting that you will see much later. In medieval monasteries, even among the Templars, this was practiced, where a cord was placed, not tied to the arm and not necessarily green. But it was placed under the monastic robes. In the way he marked it, as if it were the diaphragm, the meeting point between 2 worlds. That point where above was the human self and below the animal self. That cord tied and brushing against the skin reminded them where the human was. Who should dominate so that they wouldn't pass control of their life to the plane below the cord? It was a dividing point between the two worlds, to remind them who should dominate, who should lead their life, command their life. See how interesting this is, because within the Arthurian cycle itself, there was a knight who went beyond. Notice how Parsifal Galahad, when he needed to give his life, he did so. He took the risk until the end. He was not afraid of death. This transformed him not into a pearl, but into a diamond. Notice, I won't delve into telling the story here, but he's a very pure young man who sets out on the quest for the Grail. A very perilous quest, where everyone else lost their lives, and he does not fear. He gives his life with complete honesty. And he conquers the Grail, the holy chalice, from the hands of King Enfortus, and brings it back to the table. Look closely, there is a very important structure to understand within philosophy. Imagine that we have a horizontal line, which is the animal consciousness. Imagine a centaur, the knight part. This horizontal line is driven by fear and desire, pain and pleasure. If a man only has animal consciousness, he will always be dominated by the one who has what he fears or what he desires. He will be a puppet in the hands of his fears and desires. There is no possibility. He will always be chasing after the things he desires or running from the things he fears. He will never fully develop human consciousness. So, the horizontal animal consciousness, fear and desire, make a man a little mouse in a maze, a circus animal, always being moved by the bait or the fear of the whip. Horrible, isn't it? But that's how it's always been throughout history. The manipulation of animals through fear and desire. Now there is a vertical possibility. Imagine this as a cross, with the horizontal being animal consciousness and the vertical being human consciousness. That has only one single motivation. It is no longer dual, it is one. It is neither out of fear, nor desire, nor pain, nor pleasure. It is out of duty. The true human being is the one who, when realizing that something is worthy of a human being, that something is dictated by nature for him to do, to honor his condition as a human being. He does it, regardless of corruption, fear, or desire. Imagine that I realize nature made me to be human, that is, to be endowed with values, virtues, and wisdom. And to be human at this moment, to honor my position in the world, I have to take a step in that direction. Someone warns me, go that way, get hurt. I won't trade my nature for fear. You will get hurt. And I say, I will not trade my human nature for fear, not at all. Because it's better to continue being human, even if I get hurt. And another person comes and tries to corrupt me through desire. If you don't take a step in that direction, they'll give you this or that. What could be more precious than my own identity? My own role in the world. So, neither out of fear nor desire, they take me away from here. Because the heartfelt commitment to duty is so grand, that the animal consciousness becomes inoperative. Beings who reach this level, it's as if they have died to the animal plane. They haven't died in the sense of having killed the animal self, as that is impossible, but of having completely mastered it. And they are reborn as human beings, in such a way that being human to them is worth more than winning or losing on the material plane. This absolute dedication constitutes, within the circle of the round table, the 13th place. Do you remember that the round table has 12 seats? In other words, they are the 12 points of the zodiac, the 12 elements of the circumference. The third level of gods in the Olympic pantheon were 12. In other words, it marks the range of human experience. But when a human being moves through this range of experience, circulates, lives this experience multiple times, there comes a certain moment when one might ask, where was the circumference born? Each one was born at none of its points, but at the center, which is invisible to the eyes, but is what gave rise to the circumference. A circumference is geometrically defined as a set of points equidistant from the center. If you want to draw a perfect circle, you fix the compass point and rotate the pencil. The circumference is born from the center. And the man who knows the circumference well can reach the center. And the center in the round table was the 13th place, the 13th chair, known as the perilous seat, which was nothing more than the center. That knight who, with the experience of the 12, became wise, took their essence. The purest, the wisest, who would be capable of completely letting go of the animal consciousness and giving birth to something much higher, a purely human consciousness. And this would be Parsifal. Who conquers the Grail in this way, with absolute purity and absolute dedication, without any sensitivity to fears or desires? In other words, Gawain was an excellent knight, but he was not the rightful occupant of the seat. Perilous. This will later fall to Parsifal, Parsifal Galahad or Galahad. There are some traditional phrases that explain this in a way that I find very beautiful. For example, when you hear Saint Francis of Assisi saying, "It is in dying that we are born to eternal life." When you see a book of Tibetan origin with the voice of silence that says, "Abandon your life if you want to live." Or even the biblical tradition, when it says, "Truly, I tell you that no one will enter the kingdom of heaven unless they are born again." It signifies the death of animal consciousness, the birth of human consciousness. It's a rebirth. It's the second birth that was spoken of by the Egyptian initiates. In other words, one was born into another plane, where the animal did not cease to exist, but was completely tamed and the human consciousness shown. Sovereign. This was the true knight. In other words, Gawain is not yet the perfect knight. He is not the rightful occupant of the seat. Perilous. He still fears death. This still makes him a prisoner of the animal self. He is not willing to abandon his life to truly live on another plane of consciousness. He is not prepared to master the animal self, and therefore he is not born again. He is not prepared for the medieval solviti coagula. Die to one world, coagulate in another. This will be achieved by Galahad. Parsifal, or notice Galahad, the one destined to occupy the perilous seat. The 13th, the center, the one who has definitively subdued the animal self and conquered the human self. Take note, the theme of the book is how to master our shadows. And repeatedly, we can already notice this here. In the stories we've seen so far, mastering our shadows necessarily involves mastering the motivations of the animal self. It does not cease to exist, but it obeys the motivations of the human self. To be reborn, to be born a second time. Now, as a legitimate human being, to be born in body, to be born in consciousness. To be reborn definitively human. That's the idea. Learn to see your animal self from the outside, and bravely, becoming connected to purposes other than his own. Whether we like it or not, the purposes of the animal self will always be selfish. And human nature will necessarily have to find fraternity to fulfill itself. Will, love, and intelligence are quintessential human attributes. They are tools in the service of unity. And so we are born again, and thus we confront and master our shadows. And that's it. We'll stop here for today. I hope you are enjoying it. Notice that the stories are dense, they are complex. But I hope you are reflecting on them. Capable of forming relationships, capable of learning to see their own shadows and beginning to rehearse. Master them. Thank you.